Scott Matlock was a player that we hadn't heard much about all offseason until the final interview with Jim Harbaugh from minicamp, and he had some very high praise for him. I mean, just listen to this clip.
He's just all about his business, all about the work, all about the team. Like a lot of leaders, it's not about what they say, it's about what they do. He smashed the conditioning test, and then he felt the ground was a little too soft because it had rained, and we were in the late morning, and I watched him go and pat down the surface so it was harder for the next group that was running, making the surface harder so they could get their plant and turn. Just everything that he does, every way that he goes from meeting to the training environment to the practices, there every day. I mean, the power of the there every day, Ted, there's no question that you get better at football by being there every day.
So my immediate takeaway from this was that he identified Scott Matlock as a leader and someone who leads by example. He brought up that story of him cleaning up the turf on the practice field after the rain as an example of his leadership, but also I noticed that he said he smashed the conditioning test. He also said the only other guy that I remember Jim Harbaugh saying smashed the conditioning test was Justin Herbert. And he said Justin Herbert could be an edge rusher or a tight end. And we'll get to that tight end stuff later. But Scott Matlock smashed the conditioning test and then went and cleaned up the field. If we look at Scott Matlock's RAS score coming out of college, he went to Boise State. You can see how absurdly athletic that he is for a defensive lineman with some great speed and agility while not having any real size concerns. 6'4" is pretty good as an interior defensive lineman. It's a little bit tall, but under 300 pounds. That's not too big of a deal. And honestly, these are his measurables coming out of Boise State. So he might be over 300 pounds now, add a little bit of girth to him. Plus, he's with Ben Herbert now, and I'm sure he's going to be able to add some mass onto him to get over that 300 pound mark. I mean, just look at the way that Zion Johnson looks already. The guy looks like Hulk. And just look at Scott Matlock himself right now. I mean, the guy is like a ginger Viking. We got two ginger Vikings on this team. Number one, Scott Matlock, obviously, and then Hayden Hurst. But Scott Matlock was the 6th round pick out of Boise State in the 2023 draft last year. And this is a guy who has an extremely high ceiling. I already showed you the numbers that prove how good of an athlete he is, because that was actually one of the questions of his coming out of college, is how good of an athlete is he? And Jim Harbaugh himself said he smashed the conditioning test with Ben Herbert, but he also played tight end in high school and he played basketball as well. So he's a multi-sport athlete. He wasn't just dabbling at the tight end position and playing for fun in high school. He was an all-conference tight end player, as well as an offensive lineman and a defensive lineman in his senior season at Homedale High School. And he also played golf in high school, which I guess that's another sport that he plays that shows his patience and his discipline, right? And it shows maybe his technique, that he can get better at football and his technique. But I am more interested in this tight end stuff than the golf stuff. He was only a 2-star prospect coming out of high school, decided to commit to Boise State where he played 5 seasons. And at Boise State, he was a 3-year starter at the defensive line position, but also contributed as a tight end for 2 different touchdowns in the red zone. I already talked about a couple times already how Jim Harbaugh and Greg Roman, they are no stranger to putting in those offensive linemen and even defensive linemen at the fullback and tight end positions in those jumbo sets in order to confuse defenses in short yardage situations. And Scott Matlock, he has shown the ability to be an actual tight end in high school at a very high level, kind of like Joe Alt, actually. So you have your pick right now. You can put Joe Alt out there, or you can put Scott Matlock out there at tight end in those jumbo sets in the red zone. And even Trey Pipkins, he caught a touchdown in the NFL already. So you have 3 guys to choose from, plus Jordan McFadden. We saw him at fullback. There are so many things that we can do with all of these offensive linemen and defensive linemen. They have so much room for creativity in those short yardage situations. Plus, we got Gus Edwards back there. Okay, this is about Scott Matlock. I'm getting way too excited about these red zone scenarios. But my point is, Scott Matlock, he has shown the ability to play tight end at an all-conference level in high school, as well as playing it at Boise State. He was 2 for 2 in his targets to conversion into touchdown ratio. So, give him a shot. But as a defensive lineman, Scott Matlock is a very high motor player that has a pretty good combination of power as well as quickness, which is exactly what you want in an interior defensive lineman in this Jesse Minter scheme. He plays a little bit wild at times, reminds me a little bit of Derek Wolfe because of like his play style and honestly just like the look of him, but also a guy that came out this year, Braden Fisk. He's not as polished or quick as Braden Fisk. I mean, Braden Fisk was like next level quick and athletic, but that is kind of the play style in terms of pass rush ability and the run stop ability. He's able to eat up gaps and clog runs, but he doesn't do it consistently, and he is susceptible to being like blown back by a double team block or a cut block that he just doesn't really see coming. I will say that he rarely fell down when I was watching him, which after watching Joey Bosa and every single snap he played last year and how reckless he was, it was nice to see someone that, you know, would rarely touch the turf. But I actually went back to see if he was a wrestler because, you know, I was pretty impressed with his balance and his hips, and he was a wrestler in high school as well. So we're talking about a guy who's just a pure athlete, played multiple different sports, multiple different positions in football, and a very high effort player, very high motor player who is willing to do the dirty work on the field. So it is no wonder that Jim Harbaugh loves him. Never really like in a good position, I guess I would say, specifically because of this Brandon Staley defense. You guys know how bad that was, but he did manage. They were really not good at all. But Jim Harbaugh said that Scott Matlock is there every day, working hard to get better, which will happen if you show up every day, just like Jim Harbaugh said. And he even mentioned Scott Matlock as one of the major leaders on this team and a tone setter in practices.
The ones I've said, Derwin, no doubt about it. Justin, no question about it. Rashawn Slater, Joey, Khalil, Scotty Matlock, the way they set the tone, the way they lead. And guys lead in different ways. I mean, there's example setters, tone setters.
Right now, Scott Matlock is projected to be a starter on this defensive line alongside Poona Ford on the interior. I think the reason that he's currently already a leader on this team, but also somebody who elevates the defenders around him. I mean, the Chargers, they really haven't had a good defensive lineman for a long time. I mean, Jerry Tillery was the last guy that we really took a big swing at in the first round to try to get that good defensive lineman, and we saw how well that paid off for us. But we really need someone that can just take on blockers and free up the other pass rushers on the passing downs, while also freeing up the linebackers and the defensive backs and the running plays so that they can just come downfield cleanly and make the tackle. Having a good defensive lineman to eat up those blocks and those gaps, like Scott Matlock couldn't potentially do, it is so valuable in a defense. And Jim Harbaugh, he sees that potential in Scott Matlock. Scott Matlock, he just now needs to prove himself and develop his game in order to prove Coach Harbaugh correct. And I hope that Kimani Vidal proves me to be correct, because I made some pretty bold claims in this video.